be sure to check out Jaguar Gator 8 today, where an all-new video on college football history drops today at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner now to join the channel. And now, on with our feature presentation. The Heidi game. Quite possibly the most influential and important game in the history of professional football when it comes to its impact on television and future broadcasting rules. The story of the Heidi game is well documented, and I've done so many videos on the game at this point in depth. So if you want to learn more about the intricacies of this game, how it happened, and the fallout from it, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, in short, the Heidi game was a 1968 battle between the 7-2 New York Jets and the 7-2 Oakland Raiders, two of the best teams in the American Football League. The game ran way longer than expected, due to the fact that the game was super high scoring, the fact that both quarterbacks threw the ball a lot, and the fact that the game was a penalty fest, with 19 total penalties between the two teams stopping the action. After the game was supposed to end, NBC was supposed to premiere the made-for-television movie Heidi, based on the 1880 novel of the same name. The problem? Because the game ran for longer than 3 hours, NBC on the East Coast made the highly controversial decision, with the Jets leading 32-29 and less than 2 minutes left in the contest, to flip away from the game to show the movie, leaving the entire East Coast in the dark as to how the game ended. While fans and viewers were outraged, they'd be even more outraged when they watched the movie or read the papers the next day and found out that after NBC cut away, the Raiders somehow came back to win the game 43-32. To say that this game was controversial would be putting it lightly. When a regular season game that took place before the moon landing and before Woodstock is still remembered and talked about today by casual fans, and is still studied today, that's when you know. Long story short, the aftermath was bad, and NBC vowed that they would never do it again. And we saw that at the end of the 1968 season, when the Chargers played the Raiders, and the program after the game was a children's program on Huckleberry Finn. And even though the game ran long, NBC showed the game in its entirety, moving all of its other programming back 8 minutes. Said an NBC spokesman on this, "I can't remember when we've done anything like this before. It's very unusual." Now here's the thing. In all likelihood, you knew about the first time that this movie, Heidi, was shown after a Raiders home game against a New York team. But what you might not know is that 1 year later, they did it again. That's right. 1 year later, NBC decided to do the exact same thing and air Heidi immediately after a Raiders home game against a New York team. If I had a nickel for every time NBC did that, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Because this is the story behind the forgotten Heidi game. This is the story behind the 1969 sequel to the Heidi game that you probably don't know about. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as what NBC's original plan was going to be. It's October 19th, 1969. It's week 6 of the AFL season, and we have a big game on our hands over at the Oakland Coliseum between the Buffalo Bills and the Oakland Raiders. For the Bills, they actually entered this game playing surprisingly good football as of late. After losing their first 2 games of the season, Buffalo had rebounded nicely by winning 2 of its last 3, with the most recent game being a 23-16 victory at home against the Boston Patriots. Even though Buffalo was by no means a good team, as they had an offense that was in the bottom half of the league and had the second worst defense in the AFL, as their 24.4 points per game allowed was only better than the Boston Patriots, the good news was that the AFL East wasn't that good either. The top 2 teams in each division made the newly expanded playoffs, and as things stood, the Bills were just 1 game back of the division lead and the division wildcard, behind the 3-2 New York Jets and the 3-2 Houston Oilers. Win this game, and you stay on pace to make it back to the playoffs for the first time since 1966, as especially since the Jets and Oilers play each other the following day on Monday night, you're guaranteed to be tied for a playoff spot after 6 weeks. As for the Raiders, they were looking quite possibly like the best team in the AFL, as through their first 5 games, they were the only undefeated club, sitting pretty with a 4-0-1 record in John Madden's first season as a head coach. As a side note, to learn more about the life and the legendary career of the great John Madden, click the card in the upper right corner. Thanks to an offense that was the second best in the league by averaging 24.6 points per game, and a defense that was third best in the league by allowing just 18.2 points per game, they had the second best point differential in the entire league, so they found themselves in a pretty good spot. However, despite their undefeated record, they didn't have a whole lot of room for error or for slipping up. Again, only 2 teams in each division made the playoffs, and through the first 5 weeks, the AFL West was looking like a bloodbath, with the Chiefs having 4 wins and the Chargers and Bengals each sitting on 3 wins. In other words, even though the Raiders were obviously off to a great start, seeing as they were undefeated for crying out loud, they needed to keep up their good run of form in what was their first home game after a 3-game road trip. This was the biggest game of the week considering the circumstances. Most of the country, if they flipped on NBC, was getting this game, seeing as the other 4 o'clock Eastern game was between the Kansas City Chiefs and the winless Miami Dolphins. But with this game airing at 4 o'clock, that begs the question, what's airing after the game? From all the research I could find, it seemed like the typical programming immediately after the late AFL game was an episode of Wild Kingdom, the famous documentary program from Mutual of Omaha that focused on wildlife and nature. But sometimes they would air other programming, whether it was a special report, or a children's show, or a movie, or something along those lines. And on this day, the lead-out program was a familiar face. Because on this day, after the Bills-Raiders game concluded, NBC was going to air the movie Heidi. And all of a sudden, every football fan and every Raider fan just got a ton of bad flashbacks. From a business sense, it made complete sense as to why NBC wanted to air Heidi again, seeing as it only aired once before. And this was back in the day where if you didn't catch it on TV, that was it. You couldn't own it at home. Heidi was one of the most popular programs of the 1968-69 television season, ranking 5th in the ratings. Granted, we don't know how much of that had to do with the Raiders-Jets game as the lead-in program, but regardless, the made-for-TV movie was a ratings success and a critical darling, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Plus, I think a lot of people didn't really appreciate the movie when it premiered back in 1968 because of the, shall we say, controversial circumstances in which it aired, where a good portion of the audience was angry at NBC for cutting the game early. One writer even went as far as saying that the movie should have been way better received because of how good it was, but it's infamously known for cutting off the ending to the incredible Jets-Raiders game. But they were going to give it a second chance, because at 7 o'clock Eastern, right after the Raiders-Bills game, they were going to air Heidi. And here's the crazy part. Naturally, football fans and people interested in watching the movie were interested in hearing what NBC was going to do if the game ran long. What happens if the game runs longer than its allotted 3-hour time slot? Or there is a delay of some kind, and it cuts into the allotted time for Heidi? Well, you would think that NBC would definitively state one way or the other beforehand what they were going to do, whether that meant cutting the game off early if it was a certain score margin, or cutting the game away no matter what, or sticking with the game all the way through no matter what. But NBC, in all its brilliance, had no definitive answer. A spokesman for NBC said that if the game ran long and something similar to the Jets-Raiders game happened from the previous year, that Heidi might be delayed. I'm sorry, what? Might be delayed? The word might is doing a lot of work here, isn't it? What the heck does might mean? You're gonna leave everyone on edge again and leave people guessing as to what you're going to do? It's a yes or no question, and you had about a year to determine the circumstances in which you would stay with the game versus when you would switch away. And you're still throwing your hands up in the air saying, as the game is approaching, we're not sure what we're going to do just yet. I'm sure everyone loved hearing that. I'm sure everyone loved the Peacock's indecision on this one. That's like if someone asked me, I just ordered a prescription at CVS. Can you pick it up for me? And I respond by saying, I might do that. Like, that's the worst possible answer to that question. If I say that I will pick it up, that at least indicates if the prescription is in good hands. If I say that I won't pick it up, the person at least knows that I won't be doing it, and they can figure out some other method of getting it, whether it's asking someone else or going down there themselves. But if I say that I might pick it up, you don't really know which way I'm leaning. That's the worst possible answer, because now you're on edge. You have no clue. As one writer said on NBC, not just deciding to air Heidi again, but to not even commit one way or the other and say they might or might not flip off of the game if it runs long. Holy instant replay. Won't those fellows ever learn? But okay, none of this is an issue if the game doesn't run long. If the game stays within its 3-hour allotted time slot, then we're good to go. And no one's getting upset either way. And we're making a mountain out of a molehill. So let's think. What causes games to run long? Lots of changes in possession, lots of scoring, and lots of passes. So as long as the Bills-Raiders game doesn't have that, then NBC has nothing to worry about. It's not like this game is going to have something crazy, like 71 points scored, and 9 turnovers, and 43 passes hit the ground, and it's going to be a marathon because of... Oh, crap. That's, oh man, that's not good. Here we go again. Yep, you guessed it. This game ran long, and with NBC's statement and lack of a definitive answer hanging in the balance, no one knew what was going to happen next. Now, unlike the Jets-Raiders game, this one was an absolute bloodbath. The Raiders won 50-21 and led it 48-21 after 3 hours. Oakland was dominant from the start, as midway through the second quarter, not only did they lead at 42-0, but Darryl LaMonica had 6 touchdown passes. You heard that right? 6 touchdown passes in not even one half of work. Buffalo turned the ball over 7 times, as Oakland's defensive line made the life of the Buffalo quarterback, whether it was Jack Kemp or James Harris, a living nightmare, as the Raiders forced 6 sacks. The second half was a formality and was just about getting out of there without any injuries, as you can make the legitimate argument that the first half was the greatest half of football that the Raiders ever played, as they dominated on their way to holding on to their lead in the AFL West. But when 7 o'clock Eastern hit, even though the game was an absolute blowout, it was still going on. And now, with Heidi coming up next, NBC had the all-important decision to make. Cut away from the game to show Heidi and all the other programming for the night on time, and make football and Raider fans relive their nightmare from last year, or keep the game on and push everything back until the game finally ends. And this time, even though the game was a bloodbath, and even though children and families were eagerly awaiting to see the movie, NBC decided to throw football fans a bone. Despite what they indicated in the week leading up to the game, they weren't going to repeat the same mistake that they did last year. And so, even though the game ran long, everyone got to see the game in its entirety, and got to see the Raiders tack on a safety at the end to win it by a final score of 50-21. Heidi started at 7:08 p.m. Every other program was pushed back by 8 minutes, and the national programs flipped to local coverage at 11:08 instead of 11. It was a nightmare for the station. It was a headache having to push everything back. But the risk of doing that outweighed the risk of having to deal with the furor of football fans yet again. Even if this game was never close, and was not hanging in the balance like Jets-Raiders was a year ago. For what it's worth, I did say there were 2 NBC games at that 4 o'clock window, and if you were in the part of the country getting Dolphins-Chiefs, this was a non-issue, as that game, won 17-10 by the Chiefs, ended at 6:45, 15 minutes before Heidi was scheduled to start. Heidi is more known today, half a century after its release, for its role on football and its role in shaping sports television forever than it is for its actual quality as a movie. It's funny how that worked out, because obviously, no one associated with the movie and the production of it intended for that to be the case. But at least on this day, football and Heidi coexisted. NBC made a ton of mistakes back in the day, and obviously, they made a catastrophic one in 1968, 1 year before this. But even though it was tempting, even though they were debating it, and even though the game was never in doubt, they weren't going to make the same mistake twice. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.